Hello all, my name is Lina Wendland and I head UN Human Rights work on business and human rights from our headquarters in Geneva. I would like to thank the working group for inviting me to share what our office has been doing in the field of access to remedy as part of our accountability and remedy projects. I'll provide a quick overview of our greater project before sharing some specifics and key findings from the latest phase, as well as our plan going forward. In 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council. In the years following this endorsement, our office noticed that most attention was focused on implementing the first two pillars of the UN Guiding Principles, and not as much attention was being paid to the third, but equally important pillar on access to remedy. Thus, our office recognized that for the Guiding Principles framework to succeed, there would need to be progress made on access to remedy. And in 2013, we began a project aimed at strengthening the implementation of this pillar. The project has been known as the Accountability and Remedy Project, or ARP for short. The project's substantive work proceeded in 3 phases, with each phase requested by the UN Human Rights Council. The third pillar of the Guiding Principles referred to 3 categories of grievance mechanisms through which those harmed in the context of business activity can seek redress. Each substantive phase of the Accountability and Remedy Project corresponds to one of these categories of grievance mechanisms. The first phase, or ARP 1, focused on judicial mechanisms. The second phase, or ARP 2, focused on state-based mechanisms other than courts, such as OECD national contact points, national human rights institutions, or labor inspectorates. And finally, the third phase, or ARP 3, focused on non-state-based grievance mechanisms. The goal for each of these phases was to enhance the effectiveness of the respective mechanisms through the development of guidance on what a good mechanism should look like and what steps should be taken to develop such mechanisms in practice. This guidance was presented to and welcomed by the UN Human Rights Council. The guidance was developed through an evidence-based consultative process during which we tried to learn about the pros and cons of as many systems as possible, in as many sectors as possible, and from as many stakeholders as possible, in as many jurisdictions as possible. We focus particularly on those who use the mechanisms, those who administer the mechanisms, and practitioners who have experience with the mechanisms, as we wanted to understand the challenges on the ground and find realistic solutions to overcome such challenges. In the end, we derived practical recommendations for improving rights holders' access to remedy that recognize the different legal, cultural, and economic realities that exist in different parts of the globe. In 2016, we released our findings in relation to judicial mechanisms. And in 2018, we issued our report on other state-based mechanisms, such as national human rights institutions. The same year, in 2018, the UN Human Rights Council asked our office to take a detailed look at non-state-based grievance mechanisms. And over the last year, we examined these mechanisms in great detail, and our findings were officially presented to the Council in July of this year. When we talk about non-state-based grievance mechanisms, we're generally speaking about privately run mechanisms where grievances can be raised and remedy can be sought. There's huge diversity in the types of mechanisms that fall under this heading. Therefore, we decided early on in the project to focus on a few emblematic types that are particularly relevant to business and human rights cases. 2 of the major types of mechanisms we examined were company-based grievance mechanisms and mechanisms of multi-stakeholder initiatives. The UN Guiding Principles provide a set of effectiveness criteria for these types of mechanisms. If these criteria are met, the chances are good that a mechanism will respect human rights and ensure good outcomes for those entitled to remedy. The Guiding Principles provide an overview of these criteria and explain a bit about what they mean, though we repeatedly heard from companies and others that administer grievance mechanisms that they would like more guidance on how to meet these criteria in practice. Thus, a large part of our focus for ARP 3, for this third phase of the Accountability and Remedy Project, was on expanding upon what these criteria mean and sharing good examples of how different mechanisms have met the criteria in real life. To better understand how grievance mechanisms meet these criteria effectively and address human rights harms, we gathered empirical information from a wide range of jurisdictions on the design, functioning, and use of private mechanisms. This was done through, among other activities, questionnaires targeted at the general public, states and users, and administrators of different types of grievance mechanisms. Secondly, participation in over 30 events or consultations in over 16 different states, covering all 5 UN regional groups. We also conducted over 100 interviews with users of non-state-based grievance mechanisms and those who have designed, administered, or studied such mechanisms. And finally, we conducted a review of over 600 business and human rights related events, news reports, and grievances reported on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Through these activities, we learned an immense amount of information about how these mechanisms work and how they could be improved in real life. For instance, we found that, generally speaking, remedy seekers welcome having the option to use these types of grievance mechanisms. However, few of the mechanisms are reaching their potential as regards providing access to remedy. We also learned that rights holders continue to report significant problems with identifying, accessing, and using such mechanisms in practice. We found that eligibility and procedural requirements are often overly complex, making it difficult for remedy seekers to engage these mechanisms properly without significant support from third parties, such as non-governmental organizations or legal counsel. And we also learned that the remedies that may be obtained from such mechanisms are usually partial at best, in many cases due to the limitations placed on the mechanism's mandate, available resources, or both. When it comes to understanding rights holders' needs, we found that there are some problems that can be addressed through greater stakeholder engagement. One of our most important findings is that the amount and quality of stakeholder engagement is a strong indicator of a mechanism's effectiveness. Engaging with and empowering users and potential users helps ensure that the mechanisms meets their needs and that they will actually use the mechanism in practice. Generally speaking, grievance mechanisms need to give much greater emphasis to the needs, expectations, and perspectives of the people for whose use the mechanisms are intended. These perspectives should be taken into account at all stages, from the design of the mechanisms through outcomes in specific cases. We came across several cases where the remedy itself created new problems and increased tensions within communities because there was a lack of understanding about how rights holders would react to the remedy. Another key finding concerns improving cooperation. There are ripe opportunities for increased cooperation amongst grievance mechanisms and with companies. Companies understandably have their own approaches to remedy, but a lack of cooperation can create inefficiencies and confusion for rights holders, and it misses opportunities to reduce and share costs associated with running mechanisms and to provide necessary services to the rights holders. As regards to the role of the state, we found that there is a lack of policy coherence in their approaches to non-state-based grievance mechanisms, which makes it harder for these types of mechanisms to reach their potential. Therefore, there is a need for greater recognition by states of the legitimacy and utility of these mechanisms, and states should take actions to help establish an enabling environment whereby such grievance mechanisms can better contribute to the provision of remedy. While these key findings can be found in our ARP3 report, so the report we submitted to the Human Rights Council in July this year, I would like to stress that the report focuses on evidence-based solutions and goes into much greater detail about how grievance mechanisms can meet the UN Guiding Principles effectiveness criteria, how developers and operators of mechanisms can improve cooperation, and how states can better facilitate access to these mechanisms in practice. As regards next steps, in July of this year, the Human Rights Council, in response to the report, passed a resolution requesting our office to continue our work on accountability and remedy. We have just started the 4th phase of the Accountability and Remedy project, and while the first 3 phases of the project focused on developing substantive guidance, this 4th phase will be focusing on dissemination, implementation, and accessibility of all our work over the past 6 years. Human Rights Council reports are necessarily dense, and thus we'll be converting our findings into more user-friendly formats and helping different stakeholders operationalize the recommendations. If you have any ideas for how to help promote this work, or if you'd like to become involved in any way, please feel free to reach out to the email address on the screen. Thank you so much.